Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today in this video we'll be analyzing a game that I played actually yesterday in a tournament. It was the 2022 August Open. This was my round 1 game, and my online rating at the time was 2103. So I was playing white, and let's take a look at what happened in the game. So as I mentioned, I'm playing white, so I opened with d4. Just some typical opening stuff. We went into a queen's game, but declined. So pretty typical. And we'll say around here is when the game really started to shift a little bit. So here it's still a completely even game, but there's obviously chances for both sides. I have a nice knight on d4. My opponent has a nice knight on d5. I have my queen lined up against my opponent's pawns on the queen side. This bishop's a little bit passive right now, but it can get active once the knight moves out of the way. It will activate itself. And I've just thrusted this pawn forward to a4 to try to soften up the queenside structure here. We obviously both have rooks on the c file. We're contesting rooks here to try to get the open file. And yeah, that's generally the state of the position. So after a4, trying to soften up the queen side, my opponent takes. And then here I take on a6. And then here, now my opponent has this somewhat weak pawn here. It's still defensible via moves like rook a8, which is actually what my opponent played. But there's some pressure here. So rook a8. I slide my queen back to c4. My idea is to try to get knight to c6 and maybe reroute my knight in some way. Get my queen to c7, maybe triple up even on the c file. I'll get my rook active somehow. Maybe get an e4 at some point. Those are sort of the general ideas here. My opponent plays h6. Bring my other rook over. Can play e4 at some point and try to open up both of these files. Again, there's knight c6 ideas that maybe at some point. Queen to b7. I'd also like to mention my opponent can actually really attack this pawn right now. Move like rook to b8 would lose to knight to c6, forking the queen and the rook. So that's the other benefit of having my knight here. I can always jump into c6 to deliver this fork if my opponent tries to attack my b pawn. So here my opponent slides queen to b7, attacking this pawn. And in the future there's no knight to c6 with the forking idea, as I mentioned earlier. Here I slide back to e2, not too much about it. My opponent puts some more pressure on this b2 point, try to get this pass pawn here on a4. Here I play rook d2, simply defending. And then here after knight to b4, I realize I have this very, we'll say sneaky move here, which I played in the game, which is knight to b5. Although this move, objectively speaking, isn't actually the best move in the position. For example, other moves are like queen d1, suggested by the computer, h3 to get some lift for the king. Those are both possible. Play knight b5 because it's a bit tricky. Knight b5, so obviously my knight being on b5, it supports c7 and d6, so I can transfer my rooks into onto those two squares, and then maybe get some form of active play. And obviously the biggest question that we have here is why can't we take the knight? So if queen takes b5, this actually loses the exchange, because after rook d8, you can't take because I would take the queen. To illustrate, the queen is now undefended, so I would be completely winning this game. Knight's attacked, and I have a queen. That's the biggest asset I have. So here my opponent plays king to h7 if this were to happen. And then here, instead of taking the rook, that would lose a piece. This rook is actually overworked, or it's actually kind of pinned in a sense, because I can take the queen, and once you take back, you'll notice that this rook is hanging, and then once I take, you'll realize I'm actually up the exchange for a knight. In the game, actually here I actually wasn't too sure what was happening, but here in the game my opponent played queen to b6. Queen to b6, I didn't really fully understand this. I thought there were some other moves that were possible. So I had a theory that queen to b6, my opponent actually mouse slipped. Because right after this, really instantly, my opponent quickly offered me a draw. I'm assuming it's because he thought he messed up and was just trying to get the game over with. And so that's why I thought queen to b6 was a mouse slip, because I thought they were trying to play queen takes b5, but just mouse slipped on b6. But that's just my theory. I don't really know. Anyways, after queen to b6, I continue with my idea. Rook to d6, supported by the knight, attacking the queen. Maybe rook to c7, rook d7, trying to double up on the 7th rank. That's a possibility. And here my opponent played queen takes b5. This also supports why I think that my opponent mouse slipped, because the move right after playing queen to b6, my opponent plays queen takes b5. So I had a theory that my opponent actually mouse slipped on queen b6. Queen takes b5, and here, same tactic, still works. And here it gets a bit tricky. My opponent does win this b2 pawn and has this a4 pawn that's passed. It's a bit tricky to win it, but we manage. Here my opponent actually gets really close. Here I play rook c5 to wrap around to win this pawn. Here my opponent, credit to him, plays really well. Knight d3, I play rook a5, and then here my opponent actually just plays a2. The reason why a2 is possible is if rook takes a2, this is most likely going to be a draw. After knight c1, say king f3, knight takes and rook takes, you'll notice that we have 4 pawns on the king side each. I have a slightly more active king, but we both have a rook, and this should be a complete dead draw. So after a2, I can't actually take this pawn outright. And I realized that if I do something really random, such as, let's say, h4, just to illustrate, my opponent has the move knight b4. Knight b4, so the idea is it defends a2, and there's no way I can actually productively take a2. Because if I move my rook off to pin this knight, then you realize that there's ideas of even like, for example here, knight c6 is an option firstly. If you take this rook, then I take this, and there's no way to actually really stop this pawn. For example, rook takes b3, knight takes. After rook a3, you'll notice that I have the move knight to b3. If you take, then knight c1 check. If you take the knight, then you promote, and this knight is currently supporting promotion, so this would be completely winning for black. So something like that is impossible. Knight b4, it defends a2, and there's no way for me to win this pawn without having to sacrifice a rook, and then it would lead to the 4-on-4 with each of us having a rook situation, which is a dead draw. And if I keep my rooks here and try to get my king active, this sort of a situation, we're kind of forced into like a bind, kind of like, let's say king f3, then there's a move rook b1, and you realize this is kind of like an infinite loop. There's no way to attack anything and win anything here. For example, the rook defends the knight defends the pawn defends the rook. So this is literally an infinite cycle for the black pieces. There's no way to touch anything here, and I can't move any of these rooks off of the a file because then black would simply promote. The reason why black can't promote right now is because obviously I have 2 pieces defending a1. So all of these pieces right here on the queen side are all completely stuck, and this 4-on-4 is going to be a complete draw for me. So I can't go for a random option like h4. And any other move such as h4 that doesn't really do anything productive will lead to knight b4 and any one of those variations I analyzed earlier. So here I had to think for a while because I noticed these threats, these draw threats. So here, after around 20 minutes of thought, I managed to play. I find there's 2 moves in this position that actually guarantee some form of advantage for white. I find the best one, which is rook a3. The idea with rook a3 is really simple. Now there is no knight b4 because this rook is under fire. If you trade, which is what happened in the game, black now has no rook. So black can only defend the pawn. There's no way to actually make any progress with this pawn unless I blunder somehow. And if you move the rook, then I can simply take the knight. So rook a3 is actually indeed the best move. The other move that the computer suggests here that guarantees some type of advantage is rook 5 to a7. Not too sure why. I'm assuming it's something to do with these 2 pawns that are probably going to be a bit soft, because after I win f7 at some point, then e6 is isolated and probably winnable. So this is a bit tougher to win. It's kind of cryptic. However, I feel like rook a3 is a bit more straightforward. Idea is obviously to trade off rooks. There's no way to actually avoid it. And then once I trade off rooks, I should be completely winning. So my opponent rook takes. Now this pawn's attacked. Obviously this pawn is kind of tactically defended right now. I can actually take. Well, it's not my move either, because there's knight c1. And currently, as you'll notice, that the knight is actually attacked twice, so the knight has to move and defend this pawn. 2 options here, knight c1, knight to b4, both possible. My opponent here plays knight b4. Slide my king over. My idea, kick away this knight and then win this pawn. Then the 4-on-4, even though it's on the king side, I have a rook for a knight, so this should be winning for me. King to g6, king to c3, knight to d5. Here I can obviously go king to c4 first, but I don't want to have to run into another check because it's a bit annoying. So I play king d4. If my opponent's knight comes back, then I play king c4. There's no way for my opponent to check the king in one move. So after the knight goes back, then I can win this pawn peacefully. So my opponent queens here, maybe mouse slip or something, then they could win. I take. And then here it's simply just a pretty nice cleanup job. You'll notice that this knight is really passive, so I push all 3 pawns here. I'll actually demonstrate here. So g4 takes away this f5 square. And then after here, I play f4 to take away the e5 square. And then knight f8, and then here h4. A dream scenario is if my opponent's knight comes back, because then I have g5, king e7, and then here I would have h5. And you notice that this knight is really passive. There's no good way of getting it out. So this would be the dream scenario. However, my opponent doesn't allow that. After h4, here my opponent plays knight to d7. I play rook a7 to attack the knight. My opponent plays knight to b6, rook b6, and then here I finish off with some nice technique here. After knight to d5, I play g5 check. H takes G, H takes G. And here I find this nice move F5, F5 check. If king takes on F5 here, then I can simply play rook takes on F7. This is actually what happened in the game. Obviously, if you take, then I take the knight. And there's no other moves really. After king takes G5, rook takes here. My opponent plays knight F6 check. I simply move my king up. If you take here, then I take here. You're losing your knight next. You can play here, check, fork the king and the rook, fork the king and the pawns, excuse me. But here I simply take this pawn. Once you take this pawn, I play rook takes g7 check. And then here my opponent plays king to h6, the most passive move. And then here I play rook g3. And you'll notice that my opponent's knight has no good way of getting back to try to stop this pawn. They can obviously sack for the pawn, but that would lead to mate. My opponent here played knight to c4, and after f6, my opponent resigned. Reason being, there's no way to get back in time to really stop the pawn. All of these moves are stopped one way or another by my king or my knight, or my rook. Sorry, knight here doesn't work either. Both of these squares are stopped. If you want to go here, you're a bit too late. You still can't get back. So in this position, my opponent resigned the game. So in general, very smooth game. Really nice that after knight to b5 in the middle game, if I can find the moment here, around here, yep, knight to b5. My opponent did take this knight and managed to fall for my tactic that I had to go up and exchange. And then later on, I had the very nice rook a3 idea to trade off the rooks so that knight b4 it's less potent in poison, so this a2 pawn would fall really shortly. And in general, just a nice cleanup job afterwards, finding the nice f5 check to pick up the pawns and then slowly be able to promote a passed pawn. Yep, so in general, very nice game. Hope you all enjoyed, and thanks for watching.